So that I don't forget. Um, One of the things that I'm not really sure we had the opportunity to air out in our discussions of chapter one, and it's a distinction that I think matters. I think it matters a lot um, in terms of how we interpret violence. Now, this is a perspective. There are other ways to look at this, and this is also a circumstance where I would say I probably am in a position of disagreement with the authors of the text. But when they describe, for example, they've described John Locke as in a sense justifying, if not advocating, revolutionary violence. I'm going to suggest a proposition. I think I could make the case that that is a fairly fundamental misreading of John Locke. That Locke is not, in fact, he is not justifying the violence that he's justifying as revolution. That instead, what he's saying is that you have a moral obligation and a natural right to oppose tyranny that is corrupting the existing system. And I honestly think that if you give a good faith reading of John Locke, that seems to me to be the more meaningful reading of that. That what he's saying is, it's not about we're going to have this revolution. We're going to have this violent uprising, as a consequence of which a brand new system is going to rise out of the ashes. I don't think that's what Locke is saying. And here's my examples of the kind of violence I think Locke is talking about. Okay. If you look at any of the coverage, on the memorial service and the funeral of Daunte Wright, who was recently, shot by a police officer in Minneapolis. Okay. There's an organization called the Minnesota Freedom Fighters, and that's an armed group. They studiously avoid referring to themselves as a militia, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, they're clearly presenting the threat of violence. And they're presenting the threat of violence not because they are trying to instigate a revolution, but because they are trying to stop acts of tyranny by the police in particular. Okay. Again, I'm not saying this is justified. I'm saying that's their justification and that's their stated objective. That's not revolutionary. That is not the threat of violence for the purposes of a revolution. Okay. And it's nothing like it. They want to preserve, reform, and improve the existing system. They don't want to abolish it. Okay. But the more obvious example would be the so-called insurrection on January 6th. Okay. The violence that we saw at the Capitol cannot in any objective sense be described as revolutionary. We're not talking about people who wanted to overthrow the United States government, abolish it, and set up a brand new government, okay? If we just evaluate their actions on the basis of their stated motivations and objectives, they believed that the existing system, which they support, had been overthrown tyrannically from within, the sort of deep state conspiracy or something like that, and that they were mobilizing to oppose that, okay? That, on its face, is not revolutionary, okay? My concern here is we throw around this term revolution and revolutionary pretty cavalierly sometimes. And, well, if someone had said revolution to John Locke in the context of the way the term was understood, circa 1680, when he was writing the things that led up to the second treatise, that might work. But there's no way that the notion of revolution as it has existed, particularly since about the middle of the 20th century, there's no way that that's the violence, as I read Locke, that is the violence that he's trying to justify. The reason why I think that's important is if you look at Beauvoir, if you look at Merleau-Ponty, if you look at Sorel, if you look at Marx, to varying degrees, they are all talking about revolution. All right? They're talking about a fundamentally, structurally bad system, okay? Liberal capitalism, whatever it is, that needs to be transcended and done away with, okay? In a way that Locke is not. Locke, I think, I would argue, is pretty specific about saying when there is corruption within your system, you have the right to oppose that, up to and including abolishing it, meaning abolishing the source of the corruption. Okay, that's at least how I've always read Locke. And it, I mean, I'm biased in the sense too, I guess, that was the way Locke was always taught to me. But, I went back over the last weekend and reread the areas of the second treatise, that particularly those that are cited in the chapter that talks about Locke. I still think I can make that compelling case that they are in some way, while arguing in good faith, I don't think they're representing in good faith what Locke intends. Does that make sense? And first of all, more importantly, does the distinction I'm drawing between what we could call anti-tyrannical violence, does the distinction between that and revolutionary violence make sense to you? By the way, if you haven't already done so, please sign in.
I think that the temporal context of, oh, sorry, is there an echo?
No, go ahead.
Oh, so I think that the temporal context of Locke's writing is different than mostly other people we read in chapter 1 because of industrialization and kind of everything that started happening. The one thing that did stick out to me when you're just describing that is the Locke saying you can abolish the source of the tyranny,
Right.
whereas revolution, I guess, would be like overthrowing and replacing the whole system.
Well, the notion of revolutionary thinking is that the source is the system. The source is the current terms of order. Okay. And that's not really what Locke is saying. As I read Locke, what Locke is saying, if that system that you set up by consent under a social contract is corrupted by someone who puts themselves in a state of war against you, either from outside or from within, you have the right to oppose that source of violence with violence of your own, because now they've dragged you back essentially into the state of nature by leaving civil society themselves and declaring themselves to be in a state of war. So in other words, Locke would argue you have the right to oppose revolutionary violence and protect the status quo. If anything, he's a counter-revolutionary in that sense. That it seems to me that his more compelling argument is that people would fight to preserve the system rather than to destroy it. But revolution is about the destruction of the existing terms of order. The French Revolution was not reform. Okay, it wasn't. Whereas in a way, even the war against Britain that led to the independence of the United States, right? This system looks in many ways like the British system. People sometimes describe it as a revolution because we abolished once and for all in the United States. One thing we did do, we abolished the sovereign monarchy. That was never again going to be an influence of significance over the United States. And so a lot of people say, as a consequence of that, it was a revolution against the tyranny intrinsic to monarchy. I would buy that. Okay. But that, remember, was a system that did not yet exist. The United States was not a sovereignty. Okay. It was colonies of a sovereign, and indeed of a royal or monarchical sovereign, a constitutional monarchy. So I just don't think that Locke, kind of what Julian is saying, Locke had not had any experience of industrialization. He also had not had any real experience of what we now would call revolution, except the opposition to monarchy. Comments, questions?
Yeah, I think that what Locke is advocating is a lot more like the conventional term of rebellion than revolution, which is...
Okay, yeah, that's right. And rebellion is, again, it's like insurrection. That is, you are moving against the system because it is protecting the corrupter of that system.
And if taken under the model of something like pre-modern China, like the system is acknowledged, or an external factor will come in and create a challenge to the existing order, because and the people, in quotes, will justify it, and the existing order being overturned will, that is the acknowledgement both that the existing order was corrupt and that the new thing will be better.
Well, I don't even think it's so much that it will be better, but that it will restore what was.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to me to be what Locke is talking about. Yeah. Colin, did you have you looks like you got your hand raised there.
So I get what you're saying about it not being fundamentally revolutionary, but in the modern context, just taking the revolt on the 6th, or insurrection on the 6th, I feel like you kind of end up with a ship of Theseus kind of thing, where even if you replace the aspects of the government that are currently there that are seen as corrupt and put your own people in, if those people are radically transformative of the system in the way that I think they would want them to be, it seems kind of revolutionary-ish to me.
I would dispute fundamentally that the activism that drove those people to the Capitol was about transforming rather than restoring the American system. For the most part, that has been a retrogressive movement. It's been a looking backward kind of movement. And the reference point of it is sort of pre-Brown versus Board of Education. It's the United States in the 1950s. Okay. In other words, they believe that that's the core of the system as it really ought to be and as it once was. Now, that's an old style revolution. Often the term revolution was used when you were, say, going from a monarchy to a republic and then maybe revolving back by reinstalling a monarchy. That could be considered a revolution. Well, we don't have monarchy, but I didn't get any sense at all that anyone who espoused any views about that, who was involved in it, sounded like a revolutionary or wanted in any fun. I mean, they weren't even talking about installing a theocracy or anything. You make the argument that at least that would be, obviously in this context, that would be a radical revolution. Okay, so it's just something to think about. I'm not so much trying to persuade you as I am to make a compelling case for you to think about. But if you disagree, obviously, I mean, it's something to think about. For example, when you get to the point where you're writing your culminating paper, you want to think about this notion of, because the society that we most resemble in terms of political philosophy probably is John Locke. At least that's the one we idealized at the time of the framing. But I would suggest that if you look at the United States Constitution, that's not a revolutionary document. Okay, that is a business document. That's a business plan for active commerce. But also, right, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, remember what the initial grievance was. It wasn't that there shouldn't be a monarchy. It was that we had been denied our rights as Englishmen. Okay, so the idea is, you know what, we're going to fix the system here by seizing control of it so that we can have what you promised us and then didn't deliver. See, that's a borderline revolution right there. But if you look at the United States Constitution, all right, I'm going to suggest it's really hard to argue that that is a political revolution. It's not about individual liberty. It's not. The original draft of the United States Constitution has nothing to do with individual liberty. It has nothing to do with reordering, you know, the terms of power and order in the colonies, just centralizing them and advancing the interests of the people who were already powerful, except for those who wanted to retain power in the states. Okay. But I would say that's a radical reform in the sense that, okay, we are now separating from the colonial sovereign. But I think even that's a dubious revolution, at least as articulated, you know, in our fundamental documents, you know. But again, I could turn around and make the case the opposite way. It's just something I was thinking about, you know, after last week's class. And like I say, over the weekend, I kind of revisited the second treatise, and I don't buy him as justifying revolutionary violence that would just destroy the social contract. In other words, simply because, you know, even if it was a contract, look at all major revolutions. At some point, a vanguard of elites had to convince the rest of the society that the existing system was so rotten it had to be overthrown. All right. Every revolution is elitist in that sense. Every successful revolution certainly has been elitist at its core. And even the Marxist-Leninist notion of the vanguard party, by definition, that's an elite-led transformation. Okay. So there's always that challenge of having to convince, the rank and file, the great unwashed, us out here, that in fact revolution is what's necessary. But I hear really relatively little of that. The closest you get to that is, Texas getting pissed off and talking about seceding again or something like that. Even that's not revolution, that's separation. That's a different thing. Okay, because again, it doesn't mean that they would cease to function as a democratic republic. It doesn't mean that they would install a new, the king of Texas or something like that, that they would in fact, become the socialist republic or the people's republic of Texas. I don't see any indication of revolution. Think about revolution as the successful shattering of conventions and power in China under Mao. That's a revolution. Think of revolution as the obliteration of the czars under the Bolsheviks. Okay. Think of revolution as the French Revolution, of the crushing of the power of the aristocracy and the crown by an emerging bourgeoisie, and then the sort of sans-culotte, rank and file. Okay, those are revolutions. I don't see Locke making a defensible case for that. I don't. But if you do, that's fine. Just something I thought I would throw out there. I didn't want to, monopolize the entire discussion because technically, of course, we are in module 2. But anything else on that? Any other thoughts about that, or any of the other thinkers from chapter 1?
I had a question about, I can't remember his name right now. Who is the person that was really concerned with striking? And I think that the book said that he was.
You know what, Jonathan? I can barely hear you. Can you give us a little more?
I'll change over to my better headphones.
Yeah, that would be better. That would be better, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to follow your argument. One of the things about a lot of the latter thinkers in chapter 1 is that, to some extent, this has been my experience when I've taught these in other classes, they tend to blur, because particularly with the French thinkers, there's a lot of ambiguity. If you notice, there's very little confident commitment to a position. A lot of it is about ambiguity. There's a lot of ambivalence about, do we justify this and under what circumstances? Merleau-Ponty is classic in that sense of, well, when is good and when is it bad? And, do we want to have the person driven in that Machiavellian sense by a noble end, therefore justifying any means? I don't think you get a straight answer out of any of them. I think it's situational. It's very situational. And so in the sense that their philosophies, maybe in a good way, are less clearly articulated than, say, somebody like Locke, who appears just to come down and say it's about property. And Locke essentially is saying freedom is about property. He really is. Okay, Jonathan, did you want to take another run at that? I can't tell if he's with us or not. Can't hear you. Okay, we're going to move on then, and if you can think about that, we perhaps can go back. Now, in this chapter we looked at for this week and next week, we're looking at the notion of politics in the state and where violence figures into that, okay? And the first of these thinkers is one with whom most people think they're pretty familiar and then sometimes find that they are not, and that's Machiavelli. What does Machiavelli have to tell, according to the authors at least, what does Machiavelli have to tell us about how we should view violence and the state? I'm feeling peculiarly patient.
Well, one of the things that he does mention, and that's seen throughout a lot of people who are trying to I don't want to say justify, I don't think that's the right word, but explain like a state's right to violence is for protecting its citizens, sort of like
That would be a
that
justification.
social
There's nothing
contract.
wrong with that.
Okay.
Well, most people who recognize a sovereign authority, who acknowledge there is, and most importantly, ought to be a sovereign authority, and that it goes for all of the thinkers in this particular chapter. All of them find reason to associate violence with that sovereign authority. So what we're trying to get at is they're all similar in that sense, but is there anything about Machiavelli that might surprise us, that we might think about? It seems to me that, for example, Machiavelli, by way of his justification of violence, at least under certain circumstances, is contrasting things like martial virtues with those characteristics of the non-martial citizen. The difference between, say, the market society and the garrison or the barracks. Okay, he's drawing a contrast there, and he wants us to understand why it's important that we take that into consideration when we think about the potential virtues of violence and of the martial values and that posture of war. So
One thing can you hear me okay?
Oh, now I can hear you great. That's excellent.
One thing I found interesting about Machiavelli, which seemed kind of similar to Hobbes, was that he was his point about mercenaries and the type of soldiers to use. It was another one of those sort of standout lines, like peace will make thieves of them and hang them.
Well, no, war makes thieves of them, peace will hang them.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
In any event, he talked about how the only sensible and I want to say as well virtuous, but maybe not in the same kind of martial virtue. I'll get back to that later. Way to use violence is to employ citizens as your army, people and your police, I guess, but he didn't have the word for that. People who have a stake in defending the society, defending the effeminate marketplace thing.
Okay,
you be their soldiers.
You've given us several things to think about. Let's take.
I also think it's really funny how he he slut shamed probability.
Yeah, well, that's emphasized a lot in this text, but it's emphasized a lot in a lot of the theoretical and philosophical writings of this era, where different virtues were generally part of this has to do with the fact of some languages having masculine and feminine tenses. Okay,
totally.
And so there was a sense that, and Machiavelli clearly does this, when he's talking about martial virtues and things like that, he speaks of them as masculine virtues. And then when he speaks about other things, he speaks about them in the sense of being feminine. Other philosophers do that, often because, not always, but often because they have a language that expresses masculine and feminine and makes distinctions, okay? But also because Machiavelli sees a value in what you were referring to, the citizen soldier, because he likes the idea that by having the citizens do both, they benefit from being able to live comfortably in civil society in times of peace, but also having the discipline and the courage and a little bit of the desire for glory that makes a good soldier who's loyal to the citizenry, because that individual comes from the citizenry. Okay, so this is Machiavelli saying this is or ought to be baked into the system, the citizen soldier. Machiavelli, for a variety of reasons, hated mercenaries. The problem with mercenaries is, of course, that on the merest caprice, like better pay, they'll turn upon the people they were ostensibly supporting and destroy them. The concern, too, at the time that he's writing, is the military left to its own devices will strip a society bare, because that's what it does. It's as though he sees simultaneously the justification for violence on behalf of the state, but also the understanding that that violence is outside the law of the state. Okay, it is sort of it's in something like what we would later see in the Hobbesian or Lockean state of war. It's a different condition of life, and in that condition of life, you know, you're sort of back to the rule of the animals. And that at the time that he's writing, with the instability of the Italian city-states, and to say nothing of the surrounding European states and so on, you're in this state of constant peril. And so you have to have a citizenry that in times of relative peace can be productive, but in times of war can be effective, okay? And that, I think that's kind of where Machiavelli has us. He sees violence as inevitable. He also sees it as intrinsic to political life, and he sees the potential for virtue in that violence, okay? Any questions on that or any other interpretations? Again, we can have a perspective on this, but it doesn't mean it's the only way to look at it.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
even though he sees violence and the state of war as being separate from like political society, I get the sense that he still does want to import a lot of the military virtue and interlace it as a protective factor in
Yes.
society, but he still recognizes it as separate. That's kind of just something I.
Well, remember that at the time that he's writing, we didn't have anything much like the Geneva Conventions or anything like that. There were conventions in war. There were accepted things. For example, if you were a knight, right, and you were fully armored and you know and all that, that was clear on the battlefield. You were treated differently from the rank and file peasant farmer who might be butchered and despoiled, but a knight should not be. They could be. This went well, by the way, into almost the 20th century, where if officers were captured, they could be ransomed much more readily. They could be returned home. Obviously, if they were on board ship, their ship would be seized. But the expectation was they would be treated like gentlemen, and they were all men at that time. They would be treated like gentlemen. They would not be abused. They would not be tortured. They would not be compelled to work. That continued, by the way, for the British military into the Second World War. Okay. If you ever seen the film or read the book Bridge on the River Kwai, there's a big sticking point there with, oh, you're not going to ask the officers to work. You know, well, yeah, we are, you know. So there was an understanding on the one hand that there may be conventions, but there's not really any law governing that, okay? Because war is total and war is absolute and war is necessary. You know, you can't always make peace. Now, there's another thing that only a couple of you have done your notes so far, which is fine. We're early days. But one of the things that at least one of you, I believe two of you mentioned, was with Machiavelli, this idea of the spectacle of violence. That's a strange one for a lot of people. Violence as spectacle. What's that? And do we have any comparisons there? I mean, were there other people who carried out violence as spectacle?
Would that be the Romans, like give them bread and circus?
Well, partly. That's not quite what Machiavelli was talking about, but that would be an example of taking violence, gladiatorial combat, and making of it a spectacle. The purpose would be what? Not just mere entertainment, but what? Why do it?
To show your people that you're like serious about being a ruler, and that they can not only like count on you for that violence when they believe it's needed, but when you can use it to like control them, I guess.
Well, they accept it. They accept it as a necessary predicate of power and stability and order, that violence is important and that violence has virtue. That violence is awe-inspiring. You know, think about the fundamental dilemma for the Machiavellian prince. Is it better for them to love me or fear me? Always better for them to fear me if I have to have one, as long as they don't hate me. Well, they're not going to despise me if I avoid using violence against them capriciously. If I don't use violence to oppress them, to dispossess them of their you know, their families and their property, right? but I use violence to enforce the law, and I use that violence publicly and decisively, they will be in awe of me, and they will respect my authority because they'll know I mean it, and they'll know also I'm doing it for them, right? And they use the example of there have been examples like this where leaders, when there has been somebody who was leading a rebellion or something like that, they would, somehow, dismantle the body and then display it in public until it rotted, or at least for a certain amount of time. Yeah, this goes right up to the practice. And again, this certainly went up into the 18th or the 19th century, early 19th century, where if a criminal was hanged, that individual will be left out on the gibbet for a certain amount of time. It was to remind people of that violence, and that violence was done to protect them. This is what could happen to you if you threaten people's security and their homes and their families. You'll end up like this. So that in that sense, that making a spectacle or a display of violence, Machiavelli argues, is necessary. It's beneficial and necessary. You can advance the image of you as a decisive, powerful, authoritative leader who they can trust to take care of them. Because remember, from Machiavelli, the main thing with the people is they don't want to govern, they don't want democracy, right? They want not to be oppressed. And if you can protect them from that, and you do that by cutting the heads off the nobles, they're down. If you do that by cutting the hands off a thief, they're down. That's his theory, right? But those are all acts of violence. Okay.
And like you say, I think they're acts of violence commensurate with the time. Like if Machiavelli were alive today, he'd be living in Florence and own a chain of trendy book and coffee shops. But he was in, the Middle Ages.
Well, yeah, because he was a really great writer. I mean, he probably would be kind of a bohemian now. He'd probably have a really fashionable addiction to something, and I don't know.
Fashionable addiction.
Well, All right. Well, what about little Tommy Hobbes? Again, this is the notion of violence within a society, and in this case specific to that violence carried out as justified by the state. What does Hobbes think about that?
I thought it was interesting that he specifically or at least this book mentioned that he specifically doesn't have any type of difference between good violence and bad violence. It was all violence, and it all had a purpose.
Which distinguishes him, first of all, from Machiavelli. Hobbes sees no particular nobility in violence. It doesn't mean that it's not necessary. Just don't ennoble it, and don't tell me it's good. You can tell me something's necessary without trying to make me believe that it's good. That's an interesting distinction. It reminds me a little bit, going forward, quite a ways, of what Beauvoir is saying in the last chapter about violence as being the only way to justify acts of violence is in the interest of freedom. That's pretty vague, But again, that's Beauvoir. Great writing, great philosophy, but often it's well, who makes that decision as to whether or not something is in the advance of freedom, But that's the first thing, right? There is a sense there that violence is. It's not good or bad. It just is. Is violence an inextricable part of politics for Hobbes? It clearly is for Machiavelli. What about for Hobbes?
I think I remember reading that Hobbes did sort of see it as an intrinsic part of political organization and state creation, but he sort of leveraged it that it was because it was more important to do that than to fall into the horrific violence, the worst violence of all, anarchy.
Civil war and anarchy, yeah. In other words, politics can't be done without violence, because without violence and the threat of repressive violence and coercive violence by the state, the inevitability is a degeneration into chaos and civil war. And he saw both. Okay. And so the idea there is, remember that for Locke, he has a pretty grim notion of human nature and the human condition. And he sees that, for example, life in the state of nature, as he defines it, is very much like what Locke, writing a little bit later, would describe as the state of war. That is, it's solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a battle of everyone against everyone else. That's not the state of nature as Locke describes it. Okay, which might explain why their theories of violence appear to be very different. But Hobbes's biggest concern is not individual liberty. His biggest concern is chaotic violence, because his concern there is, if you're in the midst of this chaos without sufficient leadership and structure and order, nothing can be done. There are no useful arts. There's no industry. There's no art. There's no development of any kind. It's impossible to think of anything being permanent. It's impossible to have sufficient security and leisure to carry out these useful arts and sciences, because there's simply no possibility to do that in the midst of the chaos of a civil war or other kinds of domestic violence. Okay? Now, that's, I would argue, not completely different, but it is distinct from Machiavelli. Okay? Because seeing something as inevitable is not the same thing as making a moral case for it, which at times Machiavelli does appear to do, I think. What do you think about that? I mean, is Hobbes making a moral case for violence? Is he saying, well, how Machiavelli would describe it, it teaches discipline and the martial virtues and all that. Is that what Hobbes is saying? No. No, he doesn't buy that. He just doesn't buy it. Now, he's writing in a different time, but it's not, in other words, he's writing in a different time, but it's not like they're 500 years apart, So if you had to summarize Hobbes, I mean, we know his theory of the state of nature, and it's pretty grim, but in terms of his theory of ultimately what he's trying to make the case for is the Leviathan, for the strong sovereign authority. Okay. Can you have that Leviathan? Can you have the Leviathan and the stability and order that promises if you don't have violence?
No, you can't.
And why can you not have that? According to Hobbes.
Because people operating at their, normal state is anarchy, like by default.
Mhm.
And the state is there to protect you from it. And it will use violence, not because it wants to, but because the opposite of that, war with 2 R's and an E,
Yeah.
is
The big kind.
is like unimaginably worse.
Yeah, and that gets back to what started us on this discussion, which was Julian's point, that the real horror, and it was that for Hobbes, was that just that anarchy and chaos and just violence in the streets and things like that. All right, so would you say then of Hobbes that his theory could be applied to revolutionary violence?
I think that me specifically or everyone?
Anybody. I mean, if you were a revolutionary in training, would one of your go-tos be Hobbes?
I would
I'm
say no.
seeing some shaking heads. Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just gonna say no. Like, I don't really think that, because while he does say, yes, people do have the opportunity to, specifically he says, fight or flee if they feel like the state has broken its covenant. He also specifically says that, the state has the right to pursue and kill them if, they're hey, you don't like it here anymore. Well, sucks for you. You get to die. It doesn't seem like the type of revolutionary violence that I would want to, if I was trying to start a revolution, be hey, we should all read Hobbes and he'll inspire us.
I think that's the thing, that if you are a threat to the Leviathan, if you're a threat to the sovereign, okay, the sovereign's going to come and get you. If you leave but remain a threat to the sovereign's going to find you. That's his argument. In other words, it's not just because you don't want to live there anymore, which I know you didn't mean, but it's like, I hate San Francisco. I'm not working here anymore. You know, the cops are not going to come and get you and bring you back and like sort of get around to eventually trying you and stuff, you know? But that's the thing. I mean, the idea is that revolution presupposes a period of chaos. It's almost, if not, I'm tempted to take the word almost out, inconceivable to envision a revolutionary transformation in the absence of that vacuum of chaos that is going to ensue from the demolition of the existing terms of order. Okay, that's what Hobbes fears most. Okay, so just as I don't think that Locke is a particularly revolutionary thinker. And again, feel free to disagree. I'm not telling you how to write your papers or how to think. It's an interesting thing to latch onto. Clearly, I think Hobbes is saying, no, that's bad because we know what human beings will do. As Jonathan suggested, they'll go back to their natural state, which is to be vainglorious, but also diffident. And we're just head cases, all of us. We're neurotic messes. You know, we're Woody Allen in a bad temper, you know, and, you know, we're horrible people. And because of that, we need to be told what to do. We need strong leadership. Okay. In what ways would you argue, we can see some of their distinctions, but in what ways might you argue that Machiavelli and Hobbes share some DNA, have some similarities?
Well, it sounds like the Leviathan might be similar to Machiavelli's Prince in that wielding violence for protection and to show your people that you're serious about it is necessary in this organization.
What do you think? Does that sound right? Well, let me ask it to you this way. Are they right? Are Machiavelli and Hobbes correct? I mean, you know, philosophers get to say this. Political scientists don't, but philosophers do. You're now philosophers.
Well, I guess they've seen it happen and they've seen it work for monarchical societies, but I think there usually comes a point which they may not have seen that becomes more similar to 19th and 20th century thinkers, where the people don't really want to take that anymore. It feels sort of like a natural progression.
Okay, well, isn't that part of the dilemma of the violence politics connection, though? Do we really know? Can we really say in any generalizable sense what the people want or don't want? Julian, I'm not saying you're wrong, but it seems to me that that poses a dilemma for the philosopher of politics, and including politics and violence, is how can we say with any kind of insight what the people want? And yet we've seen philosophers for centuries telling us either here's what people want, or more commonly, here's what people ought to want. Here's what they ought to do.
Wasn't that what Sorel said? I think that outcome can never really be prescribed.
And why not? That's kind of what I was thinking about, but can you take that any further?
Yeah, that sort of historical and cultural context is really important to any sort of connection between violence and politics, and that is prone to change and evolve. And these people are writing from their perspective and what they've seen and what they've experienced and what they think is best. It's sort of subjective.
Well, let's face it, you know, all philosophy arguably is subjective. Whatever the purported objectivity of the philosopher might be, that's okay, because, you know, we want to have those different perspectives. That's why I like this particular book, because it incorporates the philosophies of thinkers who clearly don't always agree. But if we think about this idea, and I think Sorel has it, I think Merleau-Ponty implies it, I think Beauvoir has it built in, this idea that these situations we're talking about are not snapshots. We can't just look at them as cases. We have to understand that this is history unfolding spontaneously. It's like watching a fire. If you've ever, I don't know if you've ever seen like a house on fire or anything like that, you begin to understand why when Coney Island was first created, which was sort of the Central Park for the Great Unwashed, they used to schedule regular house fires. Okay. It was a thing they did where they would stage a house fire and people would just come and watch it burn and watch these firefighters come and put it out. Because there was this idea of this infernal elemental power just destroying something familiar to them, the sanctity of the household and all this. And then these heroic, people with their hats on backwards coming to put the fire out and things like this. Well, that's kind of what history is. It's a fire, and fire is unpredictable and it's volatile. Okay. And so as a consequence of that, situations are fluid. And it's just simply not useful for us to have these absolute principles and say, now and forever, this is or is not justified, right?
Yeah,
Which is
and that's what I was saying too, is that
Exactly.
it sort of is a dilemma when you're saying, are they right? Is this absolute? Then it is a dilemma.
But see, you understand why I asked the question, though, by way of sort of ironically implying, how can we say? It's one of the most interesting things about this whole question is who determines what's right and wrong? Okay. Now, for some philosophers, including the ones we've mentioned, the decision about whether or not something is or can be justified is a retrospective judgment. I mean, you have to be removed from it and see it in its context as a phenomenon that is observable. Whereas when you're in the midst of it, you can't. And this is why, like Beauvoir with the serious man and the people like that, the true believers and things like that, they are not really seeing the thing as it's happening because they're swept up in it. And those people are dangerous, whether they are elite leaders or they're the rank and file. It's like, if you've ever seen a riot, very few people set out to go to a riot, but riots explode. And this is that kind of detonating chaos that terrified Hobbes because he had seen it. And if you've ever seen that spontaneous, all of a sudden it's like, this is bad. We better get out of here. Uh-oh, this is bad. I can't get out of here. Next stop, this is bad. I'm not going home. That kind of thing is very difficult, if at all possible, to evaluate normatively when you're in the midst of it. Okay. And so that's why, some of wasn't meaning to make fun of some of the later philosophers we looked at with respect to revolutionary violence, but this is what they're trying to get at is, hey, we're not going to be glib about this. We're not just going to say, and we're not going to be hyper moralistic and universalistic about this. What we're going to do is say, in a sense, it's situational. It doesn't really matter what they intended to do. In fact, they might have had perfectly good objectives. And that might, in some sense, explain why they did what they did. But as far as justifying it, such that we'd want to see it replicated, that's not necessarily the same thing. Okay? Any questions so far?
Just a quick question on Beauvoir and his serious man sort of argument. Would you say that the serious men, in terms of looking back and justifying it, they're not doing that, but they're pre-justifying it in their head for an idealized future that already exists? Do you think that's fair?
I think it can be. But I think the main thing is that the so-called serious man, if you that is someone who's really underread, who more Americans should read, is Simone de Beauvoir. The idea there that the programmatic thinker, who's just, means end, this is the plan. They're almost ideological technocrats in a way. That person's dangerous because of their dispassion. Because her concern, remember, is they will use people like cattle. They'll use them as means to an end. thus doing what? Stripping them of their freedom and their humanity. And so they're dangerous. So that programmatic thinker, it could be the hyper idealist, but more often it's a kind of dispassion, a kind of methodical dispassion that she's concerned about. She has different categories. I think there are 5 of them, either 3 or 5, depending on if I'm remembering that correctly. In fact, I don't have her book here, but anyway, the idea is that there are certain kinds of people who are involved in these outbreaks of violence and political resistance and things like that. And for various reasons, they are to be concerned about, if not feared. But that programmatic thinker is dangerous. Yeah. And your generation hasn't really experienced much of that, certainly almost none of it from the left. There's very little programmatic political violence in the United States right now. Antifa is not a real thing. It doesn't really exist right now. There's no core to it. There aren't a lot of really obvious, parties or organizations. We don't have, large enrollment in like, Nazi parties or fascist parties or things like that. But also, we don't have a big cohort of people who are, communists or democratic socialists or anything like that. But the thing that distinguishes them from the liberal or the conservative or the moderate, as opposed to the reactionary on either end or the radical, is they're not radical thinkers. They're more prone to move toward the center. They're more prone to value stability and order and continuity in some way. If they want to change, they tend to be reformers, which means they're less programmatic. You look at somebody like Joe Biden. I mean, this guy's not a radical. He's a reformer, okay? He's not a programmatic thinker. I mean, he's sort of got this buffet of policy options from which he can take these samples. And some of them people will say, oh, well, that's from the squad or that's from whatever. No, a lot of these are ideas that have been around for 50 years. It's just that, post Ronald Reagan, there was a consolidated move against that stuff that was very effective. And the intervention of the state and the regulation of the economy and all the things that would be necessary to make the kind of reform transformations that a Biden administration, for example, might be talking about. Those things had been made to look radical, when in fact they're not. You look at any other political system in the world, they look they're progressive in the sense that they're reforms, right? And there's still that belief in the perfectibility of the state or something, but they're not really that programmatic, dogmatic, no room in the center kind of stuff, okay? When that takes over, you've got a dangerous situation on your hands. And it doesn't really matter if it takes over on the left or the right. Ultimately, it just becomes this consolidated tyranny. That's the fear. That's the fear. And the only justifiable response to tyranny for pretty much every thinker in chapter 1 was violence, either because it corrupts an otherwise good order, John Locke, or because it denies people their humanity. And that would be everybody from Marx on. The critique for Marx, remember, was liberalism falls short. It's not bad, but it falls short because liberalism gives people political emancipation. It gives you a juridically secured right to participate in public life, okay? But it doesn't give you human emancipation. It does not emancipate you as a human being because it doesn't emancipate you from the capitalist terms of order. It doesn't emancipate you from the imperatives of accumulation of capital that capture, by the way, not only the worker, but the capitalist as well. Okay, the capitalist can't survive without continuing to pursue surplus value. That's often overlooked in Marx, right? That he sees that dilemma. Okay, and so this is why
I wish more people would talk. I wish more people would talk about that part because a lot of the things that are like human rights violations that are going on, like literally, it's like corporations would starve. They would go under if they wouldn't do that. It's a messed up system.
Well, it can be a messed up system. The other thing to think about, though, is that when you look at things like police reform now and what passes for racial justice in the country and things like that, look at the response to the changes in vote, the attempts to repress, access to the polls. Those have been roundly rejected by corporate America. Okay, so it's not always the case that corporations are the violators of human rights. They'll do it if it'll make them a profit, at least up to a point. But remember, these are, for the most part, these are not serious men in the Bavarian sense, right? These are pragmatists running these corporations. So their imperative is not to tyrannize us, and it's not to engage in some lockstep programmatic enterprise. They just want to maximize the profits of their, increase shareholder value in their company. Okay, if they can do that and be humane at the same time, they'd rather do that because they know that overall that's more likely to stabilize. Okay, but historically, Jonathan, you're right, particularly but not exclusively in the United States, corporations have driven a lot of the most dire excesses of industrial life and of imperialism. I mean, if you look at the early
Underwriting a lot of
well, not only underwriting
systemic value.
exactly, but not only underwriting it, but also going out and doing it. When you look at the British Empire, up until the first so-called mutiny, the military was dominated by a private company, the Honorable East India Company. That was a private company with tens of thousands of armed personnel that it commanded. Okay, and when you look at the scramble for Africa, all right, the whole notion of Europe imposing itself on the continent of Africa, that was private corporations, later subsumed in authority by governments or the crown, but initially those were all corporate enterprises. When you look at the chartered corporations that created the first colonies in the United States, that was the private sector. Now, they might have required a crown charter, okay, but that was private economic interests. Okay, so your point is appropriate. It's true. I think we could fall down a little bit of a rabbit hole if we just derive from that the conclusion that everything that any incorporated economic enterprise does is by definition a violation of human rights and predatory of human dignity. I don't think that that's accurate, and I'm not sure that's what you meant to say, but certainly
Cortez E-Associates Plunder Incorporated.
But certainly the degree to which large-scale private enterprises benefit from the kinds of state violence we're talking about, for much of American history, that absolutely was the case. When you look at everything from, the absolutely violent war against labor that lasted for a century in this country, clearly the beneficiaries of that were private corporations, okay, up to the point where it was no longer sustainable. And, I've heard this from a lot of people where they'll say, oh, well, but, really the so-called labor war never really happened in the United States. That's a European thing. Look at the history, okay? The struggle between labor and corporations in the United States killed and maimed far more people than in any European system, by far, overwhelmingly, no question. So, Jonathan, much of what you say has validity. It's just that I don't like to be too reductionist about that because, for example, a lot of the initiatives that we see now to advance, healthcare initiatives and medical care abroad, the struggle against, HIV and things like that, are in the vanguard of those are many of the CEOs of powerful corporations. And so there is a kind of contradiction with corporations. On the one hand, in the Marxist sense, the imperative to extract surplus value requires the maximum exploitation of labor. Pay labor to do as much for as little as possible is built into capitalism. Marx argued emphatically that is a denial of human emancipation. Political emancipation, yes, those workers can vote, they just can't afford to feed their families, whatever it is. Okay, there's no question of that. There's no question of that at all. But nothing is an absolute. And these things are, I don't mean to become French and ambivalent all of a sudden, but history is much more variegated and complex than I think we sometimes can see, All right. What I would like you to do, I think that's probably enough to be going on with for a day, don't you think? I mean, that's pretty good stuff to be starting with. We've got, what do we got? Clements, we've got our Clausewitz, and I think Weber. I think that's it. Let me just make sure. Oh no, Carl Schmitt. Yeah, Carl Schmitt will puzzle you a little bit. Carl Schmitt's a great story too. Julian.
I have two kind of sort of questions. The last thing that you said before, talking about the rest of the chapter, is that sort of what I think it was before was saying? There was something that kind of I wasn't too sure on the meaning, where I think it was her, she was talking about if you can't justify something in a contemporary context, that trying to justify it in its historical context is kind of futile? Or was she saying that it needs to be in its historical context in order to make sense?
Yeah, I understand that that may not be real clear. I think the general conclusion that I gathered from her work is not to be reductionist, first of all, to avoid being reductionist and deterministic, which in part means you can't necessarily after the fact impose contemporary standards on something, because that is to look at it outside of its historical context. Okay, so does that make sense?
Yeah, and then my next question is sort of something I was thinking about when I started reading chapter 2 as opposed to chapter 1. I didn't feel like I had to really ask this with chapter 1 as much, except maybe with Locke, but I was sort of wondering, like, I don't really know much about Hobbes as a person, and so I'm kind of wondering, like, what's his background? Why is he sort of arguing? And I'm not sure if he's necessarily arguing on behalf of the state, but it seems like he is in sort of like a similar to Locke way of saying you should preserve the order of politics, I guess. But like, who is he to be saying that, I guess? And the people who were reading in chapter 1, like, they're people who have been affected by the things that they're arguing against, and that sort of informs the framework.
Well, as a context of the political instability in England during his lifetime, he was exiled from England for fear of his life. Okay, and he lived much of his life outside of England, and he was, all of his thinking from that point on was shaped by that experience, obviously. But he also saw that kind of predatory instability in other places. He saw it developing in other places. But Hobbes is a person who, by the way, there is a decent Wikipedia entry on Thomas Hobbes, okay? So if you want more background, that would be one of the places you actually could go and get some pretty straight stuff on Hobbes. But he experienced a lot of the consequences of the breakdown of order and the rule of law, such that he had to flee. And that's going to shape someone. I mean, a colleague of mine years ago at UCLA, I knew at UCLA, had some extraordinary political views. And he remains, as far as I know, he's still with us, brilliant guy. But it wasn't until I realized that he had been arrested, he was from Uruguay, that he had been arrested, kept in prison for 5 years and tortured routinely, that I thought that's why. Not like, oh, his views are stupid, but that explains why he has them. But it's like, that's where that intensity comes from. That's where that conviction comes from, that he's seen the beast and he recognizes it, and he's terrified of it, and he's terrified of what it can do to people. And had I not known that, see, there would always have been that bit of an enigma about why he was so emphatic about some of the really radical views that he held. Not that, again, not even that I disagreed with him, but I've never been that certain about very many things, and he was. From his point of view, it was, as with Hobbes, I would suggest, it's because he saw it and lived through it. Same thing, by the way, with Machiavelli. Machiavelli was arrested and tortured before he was exiled. Everything that he writes after that time has to be viewed in that context, whatever else is going on. So yeah, that, I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah, I mean, he's writing from what he believes to be a place of experience. Yeah. And again, I've got my issues with Machiavelli. I've got my issues with Hobbes, but I can't argue that I haven't been influenced and educated by them, because I certainly have. But I've seen violence, but not like they saw, at least not in the United States have I seen that kind of violence. But we might, it might still be ahead of us. Who knows? This class might become much more relevant than you might have suspected. unfortunately. All right, so we've got, we're halfway through, which is about where I wanted us to be. Clausewitz gives us an interesting perspective, which is more from the institutionally military point of view. And yet he also gives us one of the most horrific notions of the military, and it's in stark contrast to Machiavelli, okay? Weber is the single most influential voice probably in the creation of sociology, okay? A lot of people have really understood, I think, the work of Max Weber. I know that I did when I was first introduced to his work through sociology. I didn't realize, for example, how emphatic he was about the coercive monopoly of the state, because in a lot of his other sociological writings, he seems so obviously to be acknowledging human dignity and, you know, democratic values and things like that. And yet, a lot of people would argue, I think including the two authors here, he's got a pretty rigid notion of violence in the state. Okay. And then Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is, I would recommend you might want to do a little reading on old Carl. Another one of those people kind of like Hobbes, where it would do you good to have some background on the guy. If I say joined the Nazi Party in 1933, that ought to get you thinking. Okay. And yet remained a prominent philosophical and legal scholar until he died, I think in the 1980s, Schmitt died. Yeah, I think he died right before I started college, as I recall. But his views are extreme to a lot of people, but they're compelling. And there's a lot of fear, I think, behind his philosophy, just as I think there's a lot of fear in the philosophy of Hobbes, and maybe to some extent in the philosophy of Weber. But you can decide that. Anything else? I think this was productive. I like this because I heard a lot more from you today than I did last week. Okay, any questions? All right, don't forget to do your journal notes. Keep those going. Remember that in aggregate is 1/3 of your grade. That's not meant as a threat. It's just I consider it to be that valuable because it's going to make the final assignment you write that much easier. Anything else? Okay, then although early in the game, have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week.